the indicators of the healthier water systems. Okay, next up is Erin Kitchen, coordinator for the Boundary Invasive for 3 seasons. Erin graduated from the University of Guelph Environmental Sciences program and has a background in holistic livestock management. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. So I work for the Boundary Invasive Species Society. We cover from Christina Lake up to Big White and over into Bridesville, Sidley Mountain area. For anybody who doesn't know who or what Boundary Invasives is, we are a registered charitable society that is dedicated to spreading awareness on the growing invasive problem, not only on the land, but in the water. My presentation today does focus more on land-based species, just because we do have some good water species coming up later. The BIS has been in operation since 1998 and originally started out as the Boundary Weed Management Committee before becoming the Boundary Invasive Species Committee in 2013. So during our almost quarter of a century in the area, BIS has strived to provide education programs and events to teach our region's residents about the different types of treatment available and how the public can do its part. The BIS coordinates the monitoring, inventory, and treatment of invasive species within the Kootenay boundary, and we are always working to protect our shared environmental, agricultural, and recreational resources from further impacts from or by invasive species. Today, I'm going to be talking about how we prioritize our species, showing you what species are on those lists, and highlighting some of the species that you have probably seen in the Christina Lake area. And we'll also touch on some biological control agents, and I'll explain those later. So these are our top species. Category 1 are the eradicate list. They are the top priority for a couple different reasons. They could be new to the area. They might be smaller sized infestations, or they could be species that would be detrimental to industries like agriculture, utilities, and forestry. Sometimes they are also toxic to wildlife or their environment. So that includes species that are causing erosion, again, are toxic, or they're rapid spreaders that could create a monoculture growing situation, which would remove food sources and habitat for wildlife. So they're all in all a balance of concerns for all the parties that are involved. These species are treated every year with either a manual or a chemical treatment, and all the known sites are surveyed on an annual basis until it's believed that that seed bank has been depleted. So a survey involves one of our staff members going to a known site to survey the area for that specific species. If there is something present, then it is either treated chemically by a regional district contractor or manually removed by that staff member if it's in like a priority location, sensitive habitat, or riparian area. So here's an example of the maps that we use for our planning meetings to show kind of what these infestations look like. So sometimes they are spread across the boundary, but they're a lot smaller than some of the sites that we're going to see coming up on the next slides. Category 2 are species that are being contained, meaning that they might have more spread than the species on the eradicate list, but they're generally within boundaries that are keeping them controlled. They're still considered to be high priority for treatment. They're just kind of next down on the list. Next slide. For example, the blueweed is contained almost primarily to the Christina Lake area here. We had a couple other sites way up Christian Valley and north of Beaverdale, but those sites have been cleared, and we think for both are at least 2 years with no plants present. The Hordeolissum, on the other hand, has breached its containment lines, which is mainly due to the movement of infested hay, but it's humans. The seeds become very papery, and they stick easily to wildlife, to humans, to equipment, and of course in hay. We'll get into Borealis a little bit more later on. So for category 3, we have our strategic control species. They often they're kind of the end of the list. So they get treatment later on in the season with whatever funds are left over. And often it is a dormant treatment, which is still effective for these species. Burdock. Burdock, for example, is on the lower priority list as it's actually pretty easy to control. In the first year, you'll see a rosette, and then the following year, you would see the burrs forming on it. Once you collect those burrs, that parent plant is now completed its life cycle. And if you were able to get all of the seeds or burrs, off of it, then you have taken away all the children that it would have spread. So it's really easy. It's actually one of the biggest projects that we do with students in the area. They have competitions for who can get the biggest burr ball, and they win first choice of granola bars that day. And then lastly, we have the category 3A list for species which have biological control agents. So a question I get asked very often is what makes a species invasive? And the main response is that it's a species that has been introduced to an area where it has no natural predators to help keep its population under control. So luckily, we have an organization called the Commonwealth Agricultural Bureau International, or CABI, which researches biological control agents. This research can take anywhere from 10 to 20 years as the screening process is really strict, and they have to ensure that the species are specific only to the target plant and it won't inflict damage to any other Canadian plants, especially those that are of economic or environmental importance. Currently in the boundary, we have biological control agents for St. John's wort, hound's tongue, diffuse knapweed, Dalmatian and yellow-toed flax, Canada and nodding thistle, field bindweed, and leafy spurge. So I just want to touch on a couple of the different methods that these biological control agents will take. So these are root borers. To see if you have them, you would pop the plant out of the ground and you might see a bit of deformities in the root. So you can crack that open and see if there's a larva or white grub present, or if it's been mined out. So if it's been mined out, there's kind of a sawdust-like material. And again, that root looks really deformed because it's been eaten from the inside out. The best time to look is during the spring or summer, when the larvae are large enough to see and they haven't matured yet. But I do recommend that you don't go too crazy with checking because it does kill them. But it's a nice way to check 1 or 2 plants and see if you have a population that's going to be coming up. Next are the seed feeders, which is pretty self-explanatory. They're just eating away the seeds so that that parent plant might come back depending on if it's a perennial, but it won't be spreading a lot of seed around. And last up, we have the stem miners and defoliators. They're most notable for stripping the plants of their leaves and the flowers of their petals. The stems and leaves will often have small black spots or small bite marks on them, like shown here. The bite marks are quite small and it kind of looks like somebody just went on the plant with a pencil and poked that black lead in. And we have several plant species across the boundary that have these agents on them. And every year we get closer to getting agents for new species. Very recently, the Ministry of Forest has been talking about bringing over agents for oxeye daisy, common tansy, and Russian olive trees. So now we're going to be going through some of the plants. So one of the biggest ones that we deal with every season would be the yellow flag iris. We receive funding every year to remove the yellow flag iris from riparian areas, which include ditches, wetlands, streams, lake shorelines, shallow ponds, and floodplains. It is very laborious work. These plants are waterlogged and they can be very, very big. The yellow flag iris reproduces through both seed dispersal and horizontal roots, and it can form new plants if any bit of that root has been left behind. So this picture is me this summer walking down Christina Creek, and it shows a plant that had been removed in a previous season, but they missed getting the entire outside of it. So it just kind of grew in a giant donut shape, and that's kind of common. unfortunately, just because it is really hard to get out, especially if it's in a very waterlogged area. The reason that we are removing this species and why it is of such concern is that it can create a really thick mat of growth that damages wildlife habitat. It can also restrict the flow of water and it crowds out native vegetation. So while it is pretty to look at when it's in flower, it's doing a lot of damage and it spreads very quickly. So it takes over in a hurry. This year, for 2023, we removed 8.3 tons of yellow flag iris from water bodies throughout the boundary region, which when I looked it up is a little heavier than an Asian elephant, as a fun fact. This is another one that probably everyone here in the Christina Lake area has seen, blueweed. It is one of our contained species of concern. Here, the flowers on this plant are quite spiky and kind of painful, like if you were to wrap your hand around them. And a mature plant can spread up to 2,800 seeds. Those seeds get around by clinging to people, animals, equipment, and vehicles. And these plants are mainly found around roadsides, old railways, and they prefer a dry, basic soil. It's a species that is also toxic to horses and cattle. So if it gets into rangelands or hayfields, pastures, croplands, it can cause a lot of economic losses. And it grows to be quite tall, so it's around 2.5 feet, and it is really similar looking to our native and ornamental lupins. So if you think you see a species, please report it, and we'll come out and we'll kind of assess it and see which category it falls into. Long-spine sandbur is another one. It's a pretty nasty eradicate species, and we only have it here in Christina Lake for the boundary. It's an annual grass that spreads by seed, and it's got a small spiky nut to it that clings to humans and animals. The spines are quite sharp, so depending on where they've stuck to an animal or a human, they can sometimes cause a bit of injury. And it prefers a sandy or well-drained soil and can often be found in vacant lots, gravelly parking areas, along roadsides, and on unpaved trails. The boundary invasive species staff do manually remove this species. We try really hard to visit the site here at least twice per year so that we can try and get the grass removed as well as any seed that is mature enough. Mowing it's not entirely effective, which is why this site has persisted for so long. It's good at keeping, kind of suppressing the seed growth sometimes, but it does also just grow it around if the seed is already out. One to keep an eye out for. Rush skeleton weed is another eradicate species that is currently more adjacent to the Christina Lake area. We're finding, we just found this year, I should say, a fairly large site in the Cascade area along Highway 395. This species is a perennial that can grow up to 4 feet tall. It has stiff, wiry branches that contain a milky substance, which could cause skin sensitivities. A single mature plant can put out up to 20,000 parachute-like seeds that will cling to humans and animals, but mainly floats either on the wind or on water. When it's in its rosette stage, it can often be mistaken for a couple different species like hawksbeard, dandelions, prickly lettuce, and several different mustard species. And then once it's grown, because we're usually finding it on the roadside, it often gets confused with chicory. It's got a very similar growing style. We are finding it in, again, along the roadsides. But one of the first sites that was found in the boundary is actually up behind the Grand Forks landfill on a very steep slope that we think was brought in through the movement of wildlife. This is North Africa grass. It's the worst. And I'm saying that personally. My first introduction to North Africa grass was going into a grassland to find this grass, and it has been very frustrating ever since. It's one of our more recent eradicate species in the area. It's a winter annual grass that is often mistaken for cheatgrass or speargrass. And the seed heads have a distinctly long and bent on, which is really great for clinging to clothing, animals, vehicles, and equipment. Thankfully, the seed only persists in the soil for 3 years, so there is a light at the end of this tunnel, and over time we should be able to control it. It invades grasslands, rangelands, hayfields, roadsides, railways, and any other disturbed sites. So far, we are finding it mostly in grasslands, pastures, and along the highways. The reason that this species is of such concern is that it's not palatable to animals. It has really high silica rates, which can cause disruption and pain in their GI tracts. So they tend to avoid it at all growing stages. In 2023, through funding from BC Parks and the Ministry of Forests, plus a really great group of volunteers from YRB, Ministry of Forests, Trails to the Boundary, and the Stewardship Society, we were able to remove 495 kilograms of the invasive grass, which equated to 71 industrial-sized garbage bags and a total of 334.5 man-hours just out of the Gilpin grasslands. So that's just out of one of our sites. During this removal, we did find several new sites and that a lot of our containment areas had been breached. So there's still a lot of work ahead of it, but it's a good one to learn about and share with you guys because we do want to stay on top of it. So another one, if you think you see it, or if you just have a weird grass, give us a call. We'll come out and have a look. Next are knotweed species. We have giant, Japanese, Bohemian, and Himalayan. The Bohemian is actually a hybrid between the Japanese and the giant knotweed. So its leaf structure is a little different. It kind of got the worst of the worst as it came out. So it's a little bigger and a little more invasive. All of these knotweeds are in the top 10 for invasive species in BC. And they're often sold in nurseries as bamboo. And the young shoots do resemble that. You can see them here. But at maturity, this plant is known for its eroding force. The roots can grow through concrete or asphalt, and they can cause considerable infrastructure damage. They also can cause a lot of economic damages by forming dense monocultures that outcompete the native species and threaten biodiversity and ecosystem functions. The rhizomes of a mature plant can spread up to 20 meters laterally, so digging it out is fairly impossible. It takes kind of years and years of treatment and plant matter and gravel removal to get rid of it. They're often found in riparian areas, gardens, and garden waste dump sites. They prefer a moist soil and either full or partial sun. And so it does spread through seed and root, but most often it's by people sharing plants, seed exchanges or plant swaps and that sort of thing. And something to consider if you're at a plant swap or even shopping at a nursery, if a plant is advertised as persistent or a self-seeder, a quick spreader, or really any other words that are going to indicate that it's growing really fast with very little human input, it's probably an invasive species and you should avoid it. This is the tree of heaven, which is another species from the eradicate list. We have always been aware of it, but we have just really started turning our focus more to the trees. And this one is has the potential of being the most detrimental to our area. It's a competitive and fast-growing tree that reproduces primarily by seed. It has an allelopathic effect on the surrounding vegetation, meaning that it suppresses the growth and germination of nearby plants by releasing a chemical through its leaves, bark, roots, and seed. And it can produce up to 300,000 seeds per tree in a year, which are then spread by wind, water, birds, and equipment. The seed only remains viable in the soil for up to 2 years, but the tree of heaven has kind of adapted. So if you were to cut it down, it can still regrow from that stump unless it receives some sort of chemical treatment. The tree of heaven is often confused with our native sumac trees, but it can be easily distinguished from the smooth sumac because if you crush the leaves or stem, it has a very pungent odor, kind of like burnt rubber. So it's very distinct. And the other notable difference between these species is in the leaves. A smooth sumac leaf is serrated or has a toothed edge, while the tree of heaven leaves are smooth. The sumac also turns bright red in the fall. So if you're able to stop seed suppression and wait until the fall to look, or give us a call. It's very easy to tell in those autumn months. The reason that there's such a huge focus on the tree of heaven in particular is because of all of those reasons, but also because it is the preferred host for the spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive insect that is regulated in Canada because it poses a major threat to our grape, fruit tree, and forestry industries. And so a couple different research groups and several invasive species organizations are working very diligently to try and make sure that that insect doesn't make its way into BC. Now we have two blackberry species that, again, are kind of strictly in the Christina Lake area. The cutleaf blackberry is a deciduous shrub that grows into very thick, dense bushes or thickets that are full of very sharp thorns. It can grow to over 9 feet high and it's very common in garden dump sites, but it can survive in almost any soil type. It reproduces through seed and root, and it can grow offshoots from its roots or stems, as well as any canes. So if someone is cleaning up their yard and just cutting these stems, they actually can't go into the compost at the landfill. They need to be bagged and put in with the regular garbage, because anywhere that a cane or branch touches soil, it can send down a root and then become a giant hedge. It can be removed by digging, and sometimes goats are used to suppress its growth. I think that's something that they do at the coast. It's very easily spread by bears and birds that eat the seeds and move to a new location with it coming out the other end. And it's considered invasive due to those dense thickets. So they are outcompeting native vegetation, and sometimes they can be so thick that they're impeding the movement of large or migratory animals. The Himalayan blackberry is very similar. The major differences is that it's quite a bit bigger. The thickets can grow up to 16 feet in height, and they're putting out approximately 13,000 seeds per square meter. And they too can root whenever a cane comes into contact with soil. So again, those need to go into the landfill and not a compost or a garden dump site. And now it's Borealism time. This is the one that we get the most calls for. It's a very highly adaptive plant. It starts out as an annual species, but when the woody stem is disturbed, it can actually turn its shelf or mutate into a perennial species. Sometimes we'll see if it's being mowed for control, it will not grow higher than what it believes your mower height to be at. So they stay quite small and flower and put out seed at smaller heights than what they would normally grow to. The seeds survive in your soil for up to 9 years. So if you have Borealism, it is, you're kind of in it for the long haul. It prefers a dry, sandy, or gravelly soil, and it can establish well in dry, disturbed habitats like pastures, hayfields, roadsides, rangeland, and embankments. It can contaminate hay and reduce the hay quality and value. And it's really troublesome to producers as it's very toxic to horses and can kill them or harm them in ways that they won't come back from. The horses are able to avoid this when it's growing and green in the field. It's quite textured, so they are actively avoiding it unless it's the only option, of course. But once it's dried and mixed into the hay, it becomes almost impossible for them to sift it out. And that's when we see issues showing toxicity like edema in the legs, dehydration, and often death. Removal can be a little labor intense just because it does spread so quickly, but it is possible to do it manually or through mechanical means. The goal with any removal is to disturb the soil as little as possible while removing the entire crown of the plant. So at least 1 inch below the surface if you're unable to get the full taproot out. And then whenever possible, we recommend putting down a desirable grass seed as you're doing the removal process, so that that seed is kind of getting mixed into your soil throughout the process and then able to prevent competition. So a big part of our education program is doing presentations like this, events, schools trips, having a presence at local fairs and markets, and just really doing our best. You know, we have open office hours to help continue the education to the public and share our information about any new species of note. We do have a social media presence through Facebook, Instagram, and sometimes TikTok. And every year we put out a calendar with our Weeds Cross Borders partner. This project began in 2004 and is a partnership of land managers, agencies, and regional committees in the Okanagan and Similkameen and Boundary in Canada and the Okanagan and Ferry counties in the US. The project aims to provide an integrated and coordinated approach to invasive plant management by sharing resources for education, training, inventory, and control. Invasive species don't recognize our political borders, so containing treatment and education between our groups is a really necessary part of effectively controlling invasive species in the long term throughout our geographic areas. So that's a taste of all the great work that BIS is accomplishing. I want to acknowledge and thank our many BIS funders, our local societies, and organizations that provide us with so much help throughout the year. We really would not be able to do it without that. And thank you for your time.
Couple minutes for questions, if you would like. Anyone?
Yes.
What grass seed do you recommend to mix in that's not gonna be invasive?
Yeah, there's a couple different options, and I can probably, it might be best if I were to grab your contact information and I can send you some lists.
Okay.
But we do recommend, depending on the area, something low growing so that you're not creating a fire hazard if it's something that won't be mowed regularly, and whenever possible to use native species, just because they'll do the best and they'll have a lot more drought tolerancy and possibly deer resistancy as well.
And you find these so we might get by seed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of our local retailers are able to provide seed. I just really recommend that when you're there purchasing, you can ask for a seed quality analysis, which is a certificate that will tell you if there were any invasive species or species that aren't on the seed list present at the time of harvest. So then you can decide if you want to maybe take on a clover that wasn't really on your list, but will it be a problem if it's still in the bag?
Just wanted to point out for those folks that don't know, when you go to the dump, if you put your invasive species in its own bag, you are not charged for dumping it.
Yes, yeah, that's a great point, and I'm sorry I didn't cover that, but yeah, all throughout the regional boundary or regional district, we're really lucky that our landfills will take invasive species at no charge. It does have to be in a separate bag. They do prefer like a non-biodegradable bag, just because some of those, because it's not a proper process, some of those seeds could survive and maybe become an issue later on. But yeah, it's a really great program. Thank you for bringing that up.
And one more question in the back.
Yes, yeah, into the bins. There's not a lot of plant species that can go into the compost. The yellow flag iris is one that we do put into it just because it needs wet feet to survive, and those composts are usually quite dry.
Rocio at the back, and then we'll break for coffee.
And, have you guys considered including this as part of some sort of a law or some program that, because I've seen it for in a lot of front lawns, like it's everywhere. And because, you know, as you're saying, that it takes 9 years for the seeds that are still viable. So it's a very, you know, it's a big problem that we have here. So I know other jurisdictions, what they have is they have bylaws and you're responsible for making sure that your invasive species is not in your front lawn, for example. Is that something that is being considered?
Yes, we would love to have some bylaws or enforcement. I recommend that you speak with your area director to help with that. We have spoken with our neighbors in the Central Kootenays. We have lots of samples, lots of ideas of how it could go so that it's a friendly process, so that it's not intimidating or going to cause any financial strain to residents. We don't want to punish people. It's supposed to be helpful. So, yes, we would love to do that. And again, speak to your electoral directors.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing, and most of us that are elected have been talking about that for a long time. There's people on private property that don't want us tampering at all. And some of the Horiolis on private property is just goes from A to B, I mean, nonstop. And it, you know, horses do not do well with it as well. So some of us would like to see some of that happen, Rose, here, just so you know, and for anybody else. However, I have also heard the other side of that coin throughout the boundary saying, well, leave us alone. So,
Yeah.
you know, it always is like that. So let's break for coffee, and I would remind you, please, to